Well, now we're going to have Arnold Fruchtenbaum come, and he's going to talk about, what's he going to talk about?
The history of the interpretation of Isaiah.
The history of the interpretation of Isaiah 53, which you know is a classic passage that probably has resulted in more Jewish people coming to Christ than probably any other passage. I don't know, but usually when we have Arnold, we always go Rabbi, all that kind of stuff to get him fired up. Also, you know that it's always required to tell at least one rabbi story. So,
are we on?
Yeah.
Okay. I've told so many rabbi stories in these conferences, I don't remember what I told when. I'll do one right now for his benefit. I haven't told very often. It's a story of a Catholic priest and a rabbi who often got together. And one day the Catholic priest decided like to show the rabbi how much more opportunity he has in the Catholic Church to rise in authority, which the rabbi would not have because there's no hierarchy in Judaism. A rabbi is just a rabbi. So figuring they want to impress the rabbi, he told them, well, now I'm only a regular common priest, but someday I could become a bishop. Thinking the rabbi would be impressed, the rabbi simply shrugged his shoulders and says, well, that's nice. Well, the priest was a bit disappointed with that response, and so he tried another ploy. I could even someday become an archbishop. And again, the rabbi simply shrugged his shoulders and says, that's also nice. And now the priest is getting more disappointed. Rabbi could someday even become a cardinal. Again, the rabbi simply shrugged his shoulders and says, that's also nice. And now the priest is getting a bit upset and said, Rabbi could even someday become the Pope himself. And again, the rabbi simply shrugged his shoulders and says, that's also nice. And now the priest is getting angry. And he asked the rabbi, what will it take for me to impress you? Do you expect me to become God himself? Rabbi again shrugged his shoulders and says, well, one of our boys made it. Our study is the survey of rabbinic interpretation of Isaiah 52:13 to chapter 53, verse 12. And as Tommy Isa just said, of all the Messianic Jews, the majority came to faith primarily with this passage, including myself. It's 66 pages long. I don't intend to read all 66 pages. I'll be reading the first 5 to provide some background, and then I'll be selective of different rabbis that will be dealing with this passage. But from very ancient rabbis, the most rabbinic interpretation writings, the passage was always interpreted, with very rare exception, to be messianic. On rare occasions, the rabbis and some rabbis applied this to Hezekiah the king. The vast majority of ancient rabbis always applied it to the coming of the Messiah. And what the rabbis could not to reconcile are the contradictory messianic prophecies of a suffering and dying Messiah, as over against a conquering and reigning Messiah, a royal Messiah. So will he come riding upon a donkey or riding upon a cloud? A minority of rabbis chose an either-or option, in that if Israel is righteous at the time of Messiah's coming, he'll come riding upon a cloud. But if Israel is unrighteous, he'll come riding upon a donkey. Now, the majority of the rabbis were not comfortable with the option of two different messiahs, two different contradictory options, one was over against the other, and so they innovated a two-messiah view. And the first Messiah will be Messiah, son of Joseph, also called the son of Ephraim, who will fulfill the suffering and dying prophecies He'll be killed in the Gog and Magog war. Then will come the second Messiah, son of David, who will win the Gog and Magog war, resurrect the first Messiah back to life, and bring in the Messianic kingdom, and bring in Israel's final restoration. And that was by far the vast majority view of the rabbis, but was singular, never national. It began to change about the year AD 950. A new interpretation was inaugurated which identified the servant of Yahweh, the servant of Jehovah, as representing the whole house of Israel. In the minority cases, just a believing remnant of the house of Israel. And even at that time, 950, the vast majority of rabbis still rejected this particular interpretation and continued to believe in the Messianic interpretation until the 1800s. It was a period of time in European history that Jews were leaving the ghettos and thus getting exposed to many evangelical believers who witnessed to the Jews using this key Isaiah passage. And many Jews began to come to faith as a result of this. And so in the 1800s, the vast majority of rabbis began to discard the Messianic view and adopt a national view. At the present time, it will be hard to find any rabbi who would adhere to the Messianic view. Now, in the first part of this discussion, we will look at different key rabbis from about the 1st century all the way down to the 10th century that clearly all held to an individual view, but in the vast majority to a Messianic view. And the first one comes from the Targum of Yonatan. The Targumim are often defined as being Aramaic interpretations of the Hebrew. However, it's more than that. It's not just the Aramaic translation, but also rabbinic interpretations as to what the text means. And so in this Targum of Jonathan, in Isaiah 52 section, "Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. He shall be high and increase and be exceedingly strong. As the house of Israel looked to him during those many days, because their countenance was darkened among the peoples, and their complexion beyond the sons of men, so will he scatter many peoples. At him kings will be silent, and put their hands upon their mouths, because that which was not told them have they seen, and that which they had not heard have they observed." In Isaiah 53, "Who had believed this our glad tidings, and the strength of the mighty arm of the Lord, upon whom as thus had it been revealed. The righteous will grow up before him, he like blooming shoots, and like a tree which sends forth its roots to streams of water will they increase, a holy generation in the land that was in need of him. His countenance no profane countenance, and the terror of him not the terror of an ordinary man. His complexion shall be a holy complexion, and all who see him will look wistfully upon him, and then he'll become despised and will cut off glory of all the kingdoms, and they will prostrate and exercise mourning like a man of pains, and like one who is destined for sicknesses, as though the presence of the Shekinah had been withdrawn from us. They will be despised and esteemed not. Then for our sins he will pray, and our iniquities for his sake he shall be forgiving, although we are accounted stricken, smitten from before the Lord and afflicted. We will build up the holy place, which has been polluted for our sins, and delivered to the enemies of our iniquities. And by his instruction peace shall be increased upon us, and by devotion to his words our sins will be forgiven us. All we like sheep have been scattered. We had each wandered off in our way, but it was the Lord's good pleasure to forgive the sins of all of us for his sake. He prayed, and he was answered, and ere even he had opened his mouth, he was accepted. The mighty of the peoples he will deliver like sheep to the slaughter, and like a lamb dumb before shearers. There shall be none before him opening his mouth or saying a word. Out of chastisements and punishments he will bring out our captives near. The wondrous things done to us in his days, who shall be able to tell? For he will cause the dominion of the Gentiles to pass away from the land of Israel, and transfer to them the sins which my people have committed. He will deliver the wicked into Gehinnom, and those that are rich in possessions in the depth of utter destructions. And in those who commit sin may not be established, nor speak deceits with their mouths. It is the Lord's good pleasure to try and to purify the remnant of the people, so as to cleanse their souls from sin. These shall look on the kingdom of their Messiah. Their sons and their daughters shall be multiplied. They shall prolong their days, and those who perform the law of the Lord shall prosper in his good pleasure. From the subjection of the nations he will deliver the soul. They shall look upon the punishment of those that hate them, and be satisfied to the law. And for the sins he will intercede. Then will I divide for him the spoil of many peoples, and the possessions of the strong cities shall he divide as prey, because he delivered up his soul to death, and made rebellious subject to the law. He shall intercede for many sins, and the rebellious for his sake shall be forgiven. That was a lengthy quote, but that gives you just one taste of how the Targumim actually put together. The Talmud of Jerusalem on page 4, Rabbi Yonah said, it is written, I'll allot him a portion with the many. This refers to Rabbi Akiba in the study of the Midrash, the Halachot, and the Haggadot. Rabbi Akiba was a key 2nd century rabbi who declared the Simon bar Kosiba as being the Simon bar Kokhba, the Messiah, and was the first false Messiah following the time of Yeshua, following the time of Jesus. But this is the exception to the rule. It was still an individual, but the vast majority still held to the Messianic view. The Talmud of Babylon, the Messiah, what is his name? The rabbis say the leprous one, and those of the house of Rav say the sick one, as it is said, surely he had borne our sicknesses. A short quotation from Isaiah 53, but it's Messianic. The Midrash Rabbah, dealing with the book of Ruth, says this, he is speaking of the King Messiah, come hither, draw near to the throne, eat of the bread that is the bread of the kingdom, and dip your morsel in the vinegar. This is for his chastisements, as it is said, and quoting Isaiah 53, was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. From the Yalkut, another large element of the Midrashim, who are you, O great mountain? Quoting Zechariah. This refers to the King Messiah. And why does he call him the great mountain? Because greater than the patriarchs, as it is said, my servant shall be highly lifted up and lofty exceedingly. He'll be higher than Abraham, who says, I raise high my hands unto the Lord. Lifted above Moses, to whom it is said, lift up your bosom, loftier than the ministering angels, of whom is written, the wheels were lofty and terrible. And so on. This a little bit similar to the book of Hebrews, with the writer of Hebrews shows the Messiah superior to angels and to Moses and to the Levitical priesthood. And this is a much older document, but subsequent rabbis are going to be quoted. They often refer to these same statements, how much superior the Messiah will be to these four categories. And the bottom of page 5, behold, my son will deal prudently. Near to my servant, he will uphold. In the hagiographer, the Lord said to my Lord, the Lord said unto me. And again, focusing on the individual interpretation. On top of page 6, Rabbi Yahah says the chastisements are divided into 3 parts. One for David and the fathers, one for our own generation, and one for the King Messiah. And thus is what is written, he was wounded for our transgression. Then the commentary called the Sefraim, Rabbi Yosei the Galilean said, come forth and learn the righteousness of King Messiah based upon Isaiah 53. And then in the Zohar, read the later document, happy is the portion of the just in this world and that which is to come. The souls which are in the Garden of Eden below go to and fro every new moon and every Sabbath, in order to ascend to the place that is called the walls of Jerusalem. After that, they journey on and contemplate all those that are possessed of pains and sicknesses, and those are the martyrs are for the unity of the Lord, and then return and announce it to the Messiah. Then on page 7, he was wounded for our transgressions. And there is in the Garden of Eden a place called the Palace of the Sons of Sickness, the palace the Messiah then enters and summons every sickness, every pain, every chastisement of Israel, and they come and rest upon him. And in the middle of page 7, he was wounded for our transgressions, quoting Isaiah 53. And towards the bottom of the same page, because they, Israel, produced and wrought good things for you, you have borne for their sake even so many strokes, in order that the Messiah, son of Joseph, might not be slain. And therefore it was written, he was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we were healed. Another rabbinic source called Yefed ben Al, and at the bottom of page 8, he gives us to understand two things. In the first instance, that the Messiah will only reach his highest degree of honor after long and severe and several trials. And secondly, these trials will set him upon him to be as a king. And the expression, my servant, is applied to the Messiah, as is applied to his ancestors in this verse, as one unto David, my servant, and so on. And more, which I won't be citing from the same source, about the sections from Isaiah 53. And again, showing that this was the common rabbinic view. In the middle of page 10, the Messiah came up out of the captivity. He then adds, like a root out of dry ground, meaning he resembles a root emerging sickly and weak out of the arid soil. And again, that's a quotation of Isaiah 53. Page 11, by the word surely he had carried our sicknesses, they mean that the pains and sicknesses which he fell into were merited by them. But he bore them instead. The next words, yet we did esteem him, meaning that he was afflicted, we thought he was afflicted by God for his own sins. As they distinctly say, smitten of God and afflicted. And here I think it is necessary to pause for a few moments in order to explain why God caused these sicknesses to attach themselves to the Messiah for the sake of Israel. On the bottom of the page 11, thus, from the verse that he was wounded for our transgressions, we learn two things. That Israel had committed many sins and transgressions for which they deserved the indignation of God. Second, that by the Messiah bearing them, they would be delivered from the wrath which rested upon them. On page 12, the expression smitten of God signifies that these sicknesses attacked him, meaning the Messiah, by the will of God. And in the bottom of page 12, and while God looks upon their work and they do not think of their sicknesses, their guilt is thrown upon this God, as is said, the Lord laid up him the iniquity of us all. The prophet does not by avon mean iniquity, but punishment for iniquity, as in this passage. Be sure your sin will find you out. And here the words of Israel end, and the rest of the section contains the context and the speech of God, how he describes the Messiah will resign himself to die and be buried in their tomb. The addition, because he did no violence, is intended to mark the difference between the Messiah and those wicked Israelites. Later on the paragraph, the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all, and the prophet repeats the same thought here, saying that God was pleased to bruise him. Down the bottom of page 13, he was oppressed, he was afflicted. He bare the sin of many, corresponds to when the soul shall make a trespass offering. Let's skip what's on page 14. Let's go to page 15. And around the page, the mysteries of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. This reflects the belief of the two Messiah view. And Arminius will join battle with Messiah, the son of Ephraim, at the east gate, and Messiah, son of Ephraim, will die there, and Israel will mourn for him. And afterwards the Holy One will reveal to them Messiah, the son of David, whom Israel will desire to stone, and saying, "You speak falsely. Already the Messiah is slain, and there is no other Messiah to stand up after him. And so they will despise him, as it is written, despised and forlorn of men. But he will turn and hide himself from them, according to the words, like one hiding his face from us." Page 16, Bereshit Rabbah Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, and he writes, "Who are you, a great mountain?" The great mountain means the Messiah. Why does he speak of him thus? Because he is greater than the patriarchs, and so my servant shall prosper. Bottom of page 17. Said the Messiah, "Lord of the world, I accept it joyfully. I will endure these chastisements upon condition that you give life again to those who die in my days, and to those who died from the time of the first man until now, and that you will save in my days not only those, but those whom the wolves and lions have devoured." On page 18, the Holy One replied, "I will do so." And forward the Messiah accepted the chastisements of love, as is written, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted." At the bottom of that section, "He was wounded for our transgressions, so when Israel is sinful, the Messiah seeks for mercy upon them, as is written, by his stripes we were healed, and he carried the sin of many and made intercession for us." Another rabbinic document, Lekach Tov, it says, the bottom of page 18, "May his king be high above Agag. From the days of Agag, king of Amalek, the kingdom of Israel took its roots, and let his kingdom be exalted. In the days of the Messiah, of whom it is said, Behold, my servant shall prosper, and he will be high and exalted above all." On page 19, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, "Hine yaskil, Avdi, my servant shall prosper." The right view respecting this parasha it is accepted by the rabbis that the phrase "my servant," the whole of Israel, is meant in certain verses, and often as a different opinion of it is adopted by the Midrash as referring to the Messiah. It's necessary for us to explain it in conformity with the view the rabbis maintained. And the interpretation he gives slightly later on page 19, "Behold, my servant shall understand, for at the time of redemption the Messiah will perceive and understand the end, and know when the period for his coming is at hand. And the time has arrived for him to reveal himself to the congregation of those who are waiting for him." Page 20. About a third of the page down, "And so it is said in the Midrash, he will be higher than Abraham, more exalted than Moses, and loftier than the ministering angels." On page 21, towards the middle of bottom part, "When the report of the Messiah comes among the people, who is there among them that will believe it? The arm that which is that he will cause to journey at the right hand of the Redeemer. He was pained for the iniquity of Israel." At the bottom, "Yet he carried our sicknesses, being himself sick, and distressed for the transgressions which should have caused sickness and distress in us, bearing the pains which we ought to have experienced. But when we saw him awakened and prostrate, thought he was stricken, smitten of God, and by stripes we were healed, because the stripes which he is vexed with and distressed will heal us. And God will pardon us for his righteousness, and we shall be healed both for our own transgressions, iniquities of our fathers." The metaphor of healing is often used with reference to redemption. "All we like sheep have gone astray." He charges Israel with the guilt because during their exile they applied their attention to the business of their own. Later on, "For with repentance the Messiah will come, Bottom of the page, the prophet continues, because he was numbered with the transgressors, expected, as I have stated, to be reckoned among them, and carried the sin of many, what happened to him at that time was not for his own sins, but for the sins of others. On page 23, Rabbi Shlomo Astruk, my servant shall prosper, or be truly intelligent, because by intelligence man is really man. His intelligence which makes a man what he is. And the prophet calls the King Messiah my servant, as he says above all people. And when he speaks of the people of the King Messiah, it's included in it. And the King Messiah is the servant of the passage. At the bottom of page 24, so next 3 verses, he was wounded for our iniquities, that is, his being wounded and bruised by the pains which we caused him was a penalty upon him. After that, his iniquities and transgressions became ours. Page 25. Rabbi Sadia ibn Danan, towards the middle of the page, some expound this parashah as the congregation of Israel as a whole, and others in one way or another of the King Messiah, who will speedily be revealed in our days. This, in fact, is done by the rabbis, who and he points out to make they sought to make Hezekiah the Messiah, for whom was saved from Sennacherib. However, while the heretics explain it of their Messiah, by the heretics they mean Jewish believers of that day. However, they have to ignore the details of the literal meaning of the text. One of these, Rabbi Joseph ben Kaspi, was left so far as to say that those who expounded of the Messiah who is shortly to be revealed gave occasion to the heretics to interpret of Jesus. What this passage shows is that the slow movement towards the national view is because the effect the passage has on bringing Jewish people to believe in Yeshua, believe in Jesus. And that's the reason they slowly began making the transition. And for this particular rabbi, the parashah was originally uttered with reference to Hezekiah, king of Judah and Israel, but being a word spoken deftly, nevertheless alludes covertly to the King Messiah. And he shall be higher. Rabbis expounded this concerning the King Messiah, saying, he shall be higher than Abraham, exalted above Moses, and loftier among all the remaining angels. On page 27, Rabbi Moshe El-Sheikh, in the middle of the first paragraph, I will remark then that our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah, and we shall ourselves also adhere to the same view. And so he felt he could not violate rabbinic practice and tradition that this is a messianic passage. At the page 28, God declares in these verses how far the merits of those who thus suffer for the sins of their own age extend their effects, adducing a proof from the case of the Messiah, who bore the iniquities of the children of Israel, and behold his reward with him. Now Rabbi Shmuel Lanyado, my servant, that is the King Messiah, shall be high and exalted. And again quotes the old Yalkut, higher than Moses, higher than Abraham, and so on. On page 29, at the bottom part, the Messiah will be higher than Abraham in respect of his nobility, more exalted than Moses in lavishing all things needful upon Israel, loftier than the angels in the learning of the law. Thus he himself applies the expression to the perfection procured by the agency of the Messiah, our righteousness. Page 30. Abarbanel was one of those rabbis that had difficulty keeping within the messianic view. And this particular writer begins to debate with Abarbanel to hold to the view that is messianic. And on the bottom of page 30, you see his defense that this has to be the Messiah, and also the various statements on page 31 as well. Going to page 33, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. What is to be the manner of Messiah's advent, and where will he be? Where will be the place of his first appearance? He will make his first appearance in the land of Israel, as is written, "The Lord whom you seek shall suddenly come to his temple." In the words of Isaiah, when describing the manner in which the kings will hearken to him, "At him kings will shut their mouths, for that which had not been told they now see, and that which they have not heard they will perceive." The Midrash known as Konen. The fifth mansion in paradise is built of onyx and jasper, and set stones, and silver and gold, and fine gold surrounded by the rivers of balsam. Before the entrance flows into the Gihon, a pavilion is there of all trees of frankincense, and with sweet odors and beds of gold and silver, richly variegated garments. There dwells Messiah, son of David, and Elijah, and Messiah, son of Ephraim. There also is the litter of the woods of Lebanon. Like the tabernacle which Moses made in the wilderness, all the furniture thereof and the pillars thereof of silver, bottom of gold, cedar purple, and within it Messiah, son of David, who loves Jerusalem. Elijah takes him by his hand and lays him down on his bosom and holds him and says, "Bear you the suffering and wounds therewith, the Almighty does chasten you for Israel's sins." And so it is written, "He was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities, until the time when the end shall come." Another rabbinic source, Asadat Memrot, the Messiah, in order to atone for them, both from Adam and David, will make his soul a trespass offering, as is written. Next to this, in the parashah, "Behold my servant, Asham," meaning a trespass offering, Menachem, son of Amiel, and what is written after it, "He shall see his seed, shall have a long days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand," again quoting Isaiah 53. Sefer HaGilgalim. You must know that the soul of celestial splendor that no created being in the world has ever been yet worthy to obtain. The King Messiah, however, will receive it according as is said of him. He shall be higher and exalted, etc. As our rabbis say, he shall be higher than Abraham, exceedingly above Adam. And then the Yalkut Reubeni. Who is he that carries our sicknesses and bears our pains? Man himself, who first brought death into the world. Now learn what is secret from that which is revealed. Because he carries our sicknesses for man himself by the rotation of the souls is Adam, David, and the Messiah. Therefore he suffered in order to atone for the sins of our first parents, and he brought death unto the world. Yalkut Hadash on page 35 at the bottom, "But now the Messiah frees them. From them, as is written, he was wounded for our transgressions." And then Herz Homburg, again following the individual interpretation, asking the questions, who was wounded, whose transgressions, who carried the sicknesses. And on page 36, he concludes, the fact is, it refers to the King Messiah, who will come in the latter days, when it will be the Lord's good pleasure to redeem Israel from among the nations of the earth. Levi ben Gershom, again, I won't quote from here, but he clearly makes Messiah to be the subject of Isaiah 53. Now, page 37. Going down the middle of the page, Roman numeral 2, the 10th century introduction of the national interpretation. The rabbi who first introduced the nationalistic interpretation, the servant represents the people or nation of Israel, and that the confessors in Isaiah 53 is not Israel confessing their failure to recognize the Messiah, but Gentiles are making the confession for what they did to the Jewish people in the course of the dispersion. And in the 10th century, you begin to see the turning. But initially, it was held only by 3 key rabbis. The founder of it is on the capital A, on bottom of page 37, Shlomo Yitzchak, better known as Rashi. He's considered the main source of Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism to this day. Behold, in the latter days, my servant Jacob, that is the righteous who are in him, will prosper, as many peoples were amazed at you when they saw your depression and said one to another, see how their form is dark and worn beyond that which other men are so marred. As we see with our own eyes, so now he will hand also be the mighty, and Israel shall cast down the horn of the nations which they have scattered. Page 38, Israel suffered in order that they, by their sufferings, make atonement on behalf of all other nations. The thinking now switches from Messiah making the atonement to Israel, making the atonement by the suffering for the nations of the world. And when he says all we like sheep have gone astray, it is now revealed how all the Gentiles have erred. And when he quotes verse 8, that's the bottom of page 38, they shall be cut off from the land of the living. He interpreted that to mean Israel being expelled from the land of Israel. Not the death of the individual Messiah, but rather Israel being expelled from the land of Israel. Now, the only other 2 rabbis that accepted that view in his day was his son and his son-in-law. May have not allowed his daughter to marry the man until he adopted that view, I don't know. But the son and the son-in-law, here's the son, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra. This parasha is an extremely difficult one. Our opponents say it refers to their God, supposing the servant to signify the body. Moreover, if their view be correct, what will be the meaning of seeing seed? For he, their God, saw no son. That's an attack on the believers of the prolonged days. And so he follows, towards the bottom of the page, but many have explained it of the Messiah, because our rabbis have said that in the days when the sanctuary was laid, where the Messiah was born, and he was bound in fetters. He rejects the Messianic view and says the best interpretation that it must be the people of Israel. So the expression on page 40 of pains and others, these are the pains the Jewish people suffered at the hands of the Gentiles in the diaspora. Now, on page 41, the other rabbi, David Kamki, this parasha represents or refers to the captivity of Israel, who are here called my servant. And so my servant now becomes national Israel. In the bottom of the page, because the exaltation of Israel is to be very great, the prophet uses a multiplicity of terms to express the idea, Yerum Venasa Ugava, quoting Isaiah 52, verse 13. So on page 42, the 3rd paragraph, in my opinion, however, the allusion is rather to Israel's coming up out of exile, which was as surprising and wondrous as for a sucker to spring up out of the dry ground of a tree of herbage to flourish there. And so the rest of the pages that quoting from him all has to do with the sufferings of Israel in the diaspora. Quoting verse 8 on the bottom of page 42. Verse 8 is used metaphorically of the suffering in exile. He won't take it literally because that would be the Messiah. And the same continues to page 43. Let's look at page 44. Roman numeral 3, the rabbinic response. However, this new interpretation was largely rejected by the rabbinic community since it contradicted the traditional interpretation that was accepted during the previous millennium. And here are just a few examples. Rabbi Moshe Kohen Ibn Crispin, with the teaching of our rabbis of the King Messiah, we will be careful as far as I am able to adhere to the literal sense. Thus possibly I shall be free from the forced and far-fetched interpretations of which others has been guilty of. And those far-fetched interpretations are those who hold the servant was Israel. Rabbi Sadia ibn Danam, our rabbis throughout our history sees throughout this history allusions to the King Messiah, who is assuredly to be spiritually revealed in our days. And that is the same sense that has been expounded by our rabbis. Still, what our rabbis teach in this respect, we must accept, for like all their other opinions, it is right and true. And the right and true interpretation, of course, is that the passage is speaking about the Messiah. Page 45, Rabbi Naphtali ben Asher Altshuler. I will now proceed to explain these verses of our Messiah, who, God willing, will come speedily in our days. I am surprised that Rashi and Rabbi David Kamki have not held with the Targum, applying them to King Messiah, that the prophet says he shall be highly exalted. And a little bit later, in order to indicate his exaltation will be something extraordinary, it is approved that the parasha refers to our Messiah, alluding to the future deliverance. Page 46, the prophet uses the singular, referring to the Messiah, who is the king. Thus, Messiah is termed as despised, representing Israel, not being Israel. The sickness which ought to have fallen upon us was borne by him. The prophet means to say, when Messiah, son of Joseph, shall die between the gates and be a marvel in the eyes of creation. On page 47, the new majority view. The Messianic view continued to be the majority view into the 1800s, as the Jews of Europe were all generally forced to live in ghettos, and in ghettos the rabbinic law was held strong on the Jewish communities. Once the Jews were liberated from the ghetto and were able to live in the larger Gentile community, where they're also often exposed to true believers who used this passage to win many Jews to the Messiah, and this led the rabbis slowly to adopt the national view, and often included a rejection of Jesus having fulfilled any of these prophecies. Here are some examples. Rabbi Yosef ben Natan, behold, my servant shall prosper. He means Israel, who is called God's servant. Page 48. Rabbi Moshe Kohen, and how can you assert that Jesus put out his soul to death? And in his section, he's adopting the national view because he's reacting to how often this passage was used by evangelicals of that day to win Jewish people to the Messiah. And therefore, he took a national view for that reason and no other. Page 49. Rabbi Jacob ben Reuben, what we say concerning our Messiah is incontrovertible, but he does not hold this truth to be of the Isaiah 53, but of Israel. Also on page 49, Rabbi Yeshaya ben Mali, then he named, Israel shall prosper. As many as were astonished at you, amazed at the magnitude of the depression, as is the countenance of Israel, who was marred beyond man. Again, Israel is the suffering servant. Page 50. Achron ben Yosef the elder, my servant is, some suppose that the prophet refers here to Israel collectively. It's better to apply the word to those who described in verse 11 as being vessels of the Lord. Again, he took the nationalistic view, however, did not apply for all Israel, only for the believing segment of Israel or the remnant of Israel, but he still took it to be nationalistic and not the Messiah. Rabbi Yitzchak Eliyahu Konen, the prophet speaks in God's name, calls Israel my servant. Rabbi Lipman of Mulhausen, these words are proof that by the servant are designated the righteous in the days of the Messiah, because he put our soul to die, an allusion to a righteous who died in captivity on behalf of the sanctity because of because they kept the mercy for thousands. And so this parasha is only allegorically explained to the Messiah, but I've endeavored to explain it in its natural sense, which is referring to Israel and not to the Messiah. Page 51, Don Yitzhak Abarbanel, he raises a number of objections to the Messianic view. And as you go through this whole section, he also concludes, for the nationalistic view, it has to be Israel. Okay, skipping over to page 55. Rabbi Avraham Farsiol. There was a just man, and it goes ill with him. Others applied confidently to the King Messiah, who will be equally a servant of God, and the Messiah, an opinion shared by our rabbis in the Midrashim when they say, alluding to his dignity. We ourselves, however, with no less confidence, suppose it refers properly to the congregation of Israel, which the prophet addresses as the servant. Again, the rejection of the Messianic view, adopting the national view. At the bottom of page 56, Rabbi Shlomo Levi. Go to page 57. Our rabbis in the Midrash Tanhuma have expanded the verse of King Messiah, but this he rejects. In the next paragraph, the prophet now adduces a proof in support of what God has said to him at the beginning of restoration, that is, the restoration of the people of Israel. Rabbi Abraham of Cordova. The third opinion, appropriate to wise men of Edom, referring to believers in Jesus, is that the parasha is descriptive of the Messiah, Jesus, whose foundation are in the writings of Isaiah, the whole of which the Nazarenes assert the prophet meant to apply to the Messiah, describe him as he does without form or comeliness. And they claim this was fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. So again, what he shows is the reason that's important to adopt the national view is because how effective this passage has been in causing many Jews to believe in Yeshua, or Jesus to be the Messiah. So on page 59, in conclusion, the prophet declares that Israel endured all these plagues and sufferings, all they had done no violence, and there was no guile in his mouth. And so at the present day, when the truth was revealed, those who ravage and waste Israel admit that they hate him without cause and injure him for nothing, because even while in exile among the Gentiles, he was confident to fulfill the laws of the Lord. You have the section on page 59, Rabbi Abraham ben Yehuda Hazan. I go to page 60, at the bottom of the first paragraph. For their depression, they hid their face from us, that we might not see them, like a person stricken with leprosy, who are afraid to look upon. The Rabbi Kamki says, we were as men hiding their faces from him. We could not look at him because of the loathing we felt for him, and we accounted him for nothing. But we now see that this was not merely a consequence of their depression. This was suffered in order that by his sufferings the atonement might be made for all the wicked who thought that they were hated by God. Here again, it's national, applying to the Jewish people in the dispersion. Page 61. Rabbi Yitzhak Lopez. Our rabbis offer two explanations of this parasha. Some refer to the Messiah righteousness, for instance. But I would, next paragraph, I therefore proceed to put before you the correct explanation, as it has been given by Rabbi David Kamki and Rashi and our expositors, which is the effect alludes to Israel, and especially to the time when our exiles will be gathered together. Rabbi Ben Meir Ben Shimon on bottom page 61. Again, he points out the reason for naturalistic view on this page on page 62 is because of the effect the passage had on Jews coming to Jesus. And so then in page 62, let every man of intelligence Therefore, understand, on the question of this parasha, it refers to the people of Israel. So if you're not intelligent, you'll take the messianic view. If you're intelligent, you'll take the national view. Vayikra Rabbah, this is the Targum on Leviticus. And the Almighty said to Israel, and then he defines Israel as being the servant. On page 63, the Milchamot Adonai, the expression cut off from the land of life is an unsuitable one to be employed of God. Moreover, I can assure you generally that in respect to the Messiah, son of David, the scriptures affirm consistently that he will neither be slain nor delivered in the hands of his haters. In fact, this is only said of Messiah, son of Joseph, for reasons which we already explained previously. Page 64. There you see an exception of this period. And Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Mordecai Hayam Pasani, I am much surprised at those commentators who have applied themselves to investigate the meaning of this parasha. One, for example, maintains that it was intended by the prophets to allude to Moses, another to the people of Israel, a third applies to the king Josiah, a fourth, much of it upon King Josiah, and some even upon King Messiah. However, we ourselves know with certainty that the scriptures never nears to any other simple little meaning. And on page 65, he believes the passage was to Hezekiah the king. Now, page 66, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, at the bottom of the quote, my servant was one of the many titles of honor which the blessed God honored Israel. So that's been the movement of the rabbinic explanation. Today it would be very difficult to find a rabbi that still holds to the Messianic view. However, as a P.S., when Menachem Schneerson, who was the leader of a certain segment of the Hasidic movement called the Lubavitch Hasidim, he was a highly respected rabbi, and many of his followers began proclaiming him to be the Messiah. Now, he was born in Poland. He escaped Nazism by coming to America. He lived his whole life in Brooklyn. Never came to visit Israel. But they felt, because of miracles he thought he performed and so on, that he was the Messiah. Now, he himself never claimed to be the Messiah. He never accepted that title, but many of us, he never rejected it, but never accepted it either. And so many of his followers applied that title to him. But then he had a stroke. And how could the Messiah possibly have a stroke? And that's when they used Isaiah 53. And now Isaiah 53 was used to apply to Rabbi Schneerson, and that he was still the Messiah. He was suffering the stroke because of Isaiah 53. Eventually he died. And many of them who believed him to be the Messiah gathered at his grave, and for 3 days they waited for him to be resurrected. Most of them quit waiting after 3 days. There's a few diehards who still go to his tomb waiting for him to be resurrected. Now, the key source I've used to get all this material is this book here, the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, according to Jewish interpreters. It actually comes in 2 volumes. The first volume is only the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin originals, and the second volume is the translations of those. It's published by Ktav, K-T-A-V, which is an Orthodox Jewish publishing house. And they're quite honest and so on. And it was put together by Rabbi Orlinsky, who was a key Reform rabbi, but published by an Orthodox publishing house. And you can get all of these quotations and many more that I did not even bother to deal with from this one source. Okay, I'll tell you not a rabbi story, but it has a Jewish connection. And then we'll take the questions. This is a story of a Taliban terrorist He's running through the desert, trying to run away from the authorities. He's run out of water. He's getting desperate. And he looks up to the horizon, and he thinks he sees an oasis, and every oasis has water. When he gets to what he thought was an oasis, there's no trees, no water, just an old Jewish man selling ties. We thought were trees were simply stands, all these ties. And the terrorist asked him, "Don't you have any water here?" And the Jewish man says, "I have no water, but I have these nice, beautiful ties, only $5 American a piece." The terrorist says, "I don't want your Western garments. I am an Easterner. What I need is some water." The Jewish man says, "Like I said, I have no water, but I have this nice silk tie, only $5 American. And the terrorist says, "I wish I had the strength right now to take this tie and put around your neck and kill you. I hate Jews. I want to kill Jews. But to preserve my energy, I need to find some water." Jewish man says, "I'll show you I'm a better man than you are. You hate me because I'm Jewish. You won't buy a single one of my ties, but I'll show you I'm a better man. If you just walk through these sand dunes for about another kilometer, you'll come to a crossroads. On the crossroads, you'll see a rather nice restaurant that has all the water you can possibly want. So go in peace and may God bless you." As he leaves, he yells back, "I may come back and kill you yet, but right now I'm going to reserve my energy." He's gone for a while. After a while, he comes back. He's crawling on his hands. He's crawling on his knees. He's got a $5 American bill in his hand, and he says, "They will not let me in without a tie." Questions?
Thank you, Arnold. So, Isaiah 53 has been the most impactful passage for Jewish people coming to faith in Jesus.
Still to this day.
I see. They've talked about how between World War I and World War II, there was a huge revival in parts of Europe. Where
even started in the late 1800s,
okay,
and into World War I, and then many Jews even and then again to increase between World War I and World War II. Even at least several key rabbis became believers, and 2 whole synagogues became believers, and so on. Sadly, the vast majority of those who became believers didn't survive the Holocaust.
Right. And I forget, he was here last year, the guy that wrote his dissertation.
That's the leader. That would be Mitch Glaser.
Yes, Mitch Glaser says that as high as 250,000 Jewish people.
According to the records they have at the International Conference, Messianic Jewish Conference, based in London. Well, they had these congregations and Messianic congregations, so on in Poland, Latvia, and so on. They estimate about 250,000 of the 6 million were Messianic Jews.
Right, and one country had like 15% of the Jewish people became believers, and they were killed in the Holocaust, most of them.
Most,
yeah. So it's likely they did evangelism in the death camps.
In fact, one of the key leaders of the Treblinka revolt was a Messianic Jew, and he didn't survive the revolt, but the others who survived the revolt point out he was a Jew who believed in Jesus.
Well, that's amazing. But throughout the Middle Ages, there's not much evidence of Jewish people becoming believers, is there?
Yeah, there is a slow development. There was never a time there were no Jewish believers. Sadly, many of the Jewish believers in the period of Catholicism and so on, apparently were forced to change their names,
right,
and so on. Many of the Jews converted out of force, which I would not refer to them as Messianic, but also true believers. And the only church for them to know about was Catholic Church. Protestant churches were virtually non-existent at that point.
Go ahead.
Yeah, any thoughts as to why Rashi changed the long-held view that the servant was not personal? Was he involved in like a church dispute that was forced upon him?
Well, he lived in a time, like about 950, working primarily in Germany, also some parts of France. And he was disturbed at how many Jews were willing to believe in Jesus based upon Isaiah 53. That's what motivated him to change the interpretation. But he was a minority view until the 1800s. 800 years would pass before his view was inaugurated, before it became a majority view.
Yeah, thank you. A two-part question. Do we know the identity of Rabbi Zero, the one who developed the two Messiah concept? And along with that, on what basis did that arise? Like out of thin air or some kind of biblical reasoning? The
biblical reason is they could not reconcile. How can one Messiah fulfill the sufferings and suffering passages and so on, if another Messiah come to rule and reigning? That's what they could not reconcile. So the New Testament solves it very simply, one Messiah coming two times. The early view was no, two different Messiahs, each coming one time. And that was based upon the contradictory prophecies you find in the Hebrew Bible about the Messiah.
So there's no evidence that anybody within Judaism at the time of Christ saw a two coming of Messiah, but they saw two Messiahs, right?
Yeah. It came rather rapidly right into the 2nd century. But to exist into the 1st century at this point, as far as I know, there's no evidence of it. But it came in the 2nd century, it was already beginning to come into view.
Yeah. My understanding is that as high as 30% of Jews in the 1st century became believers. Could you give us a rundown and how long it lasted into the early church?
Well, it was 30% and now. Those figures, I don't know how they're coming up with. So there was a high level, we know from writings, and the Messianic movement within the land of Israel was very strong in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, began to wane in the 4th century. And by the end of the 4th century, it dwindled because of its own divisions among themselves and also trying to become accepted again by the larger Jewish community and so on. So that by the end of the 4th century, the story of Messianic Jews is a history of individuals that we know of. I'm sure there's a lot of people we don't know of, but what we do know of, and so on. That's not a movement. It becomes a movement again in the early 1800s.
Shalom, Rabbi. It's always good to see and to hear you. I want you to know I'm following the biblical mandate of going to the Jew first and to you. Early in your paper, there was a quote of a view that I hadn't heard of before. And it was that the actual iniquity was not laid on the Messiah, but the judgment due or for iniquity. I wondered what you say in favor to that? Or?
Well, one of the quotations was this about the rabbis. One rabbi said it was not the iniquity itself that was placed upon him, but the judgment for the iniquity was placed upon him. But the text just simply says the iniquity, or just simply says that the iniquities of us all. That could be interpreted either as the sins themselves or the punishment of the sins themselves, either way.
Yes, good morning. I want to say that my wife loves your books, and I'm learning to. Yes, we heard of a rabbi, we don't know if this is true or not, a rabbi who was well respected and said that he knew who the Messiah was. But he would not reveal it, and he recorded it and said it was not to be opened until after his death. And when this record was opened, he had professed that it was Jesus. Have you heard that?
Yeah, this is a story of the rabbi of the Kabbalistic movement and so on. But those stories of him saying that has been proven not to be true. Well, I think it's just something that was caught on the Christian radio and Christian TV that spread the news. But talk to people in Israel, they know nothing about this. It's mostly spread more here in America.
Yeah, Americans are good at thinking up things like that. Go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Fruchtenbaum. Those who work with Jewish evangelism, I wanted to know some insight on how this passage was used to help you receive Messiah, if you had any insight on how we can reach the Jews using this particular passage.
Now, to somebody, when the Messianic Center where I went to, just went through the passage with me, verse by verse. That's how finally convinced me. But another thing that we often used in Jewish ministries, nobody used this on me, is when they're witnessing to a Jewish person, they ask him, just read a passage of Scripture. And they don't tell them where they're reading from, and they read the Isaiah 53 passage and ask the Jewish person, now who am I reading part? And the vast majority answer, you're reading about Jesus in the New Testament. And until he's shown that that was not the case. The few who are not tricked that way is only because somebody else played the trick to them before. But it does work in most cases.
Next to Isaiah 53, what's the second most influential messianic?
I don't know, there's second most influential. For a friend of mine, Barry Leventhal, it was the 70 weeks of Daniel. And that was really more important to him than Isaiah 53 was in his case.
Right.
And the other passages which are good to deal with is Zechariah chapter 11, the shepherd role and the 30 pieces of silver and things of that nature. And then with that, certain other segments of Zechariah, like chapter 12, verse 10, they shall look unto me and they have pierced, and things of that nature, and so on. Psalm 22 is not quite as good, but it's still a good thing to use. Then you have individual verses here and there that can be used as well.
When you were in the process of becoming a Christian, didn't it take about a year?
Say that again?
When you were in the process of becoming a believer, didn't it take about a year?
It took me about maybe a month or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did your father tell you in this process? What was his reaction?
His reaction was very negative, but then, so just shortly after all that happened, we moved to California. At that point, I was forbidden to attend any meeting, to go to any meeting, Jewish or non-Jewish, and so on. I was forbidden to read any part of the Bible, and so on. So my father owned a photography studio several miles away, and he would get home about 6 o'clock. I would get home from school about 3 o'clock. So from 3 to 6, I would pull out my study books, reading and so on, studying. That's where I read all of Dr. David L. Cooper's books, read them all. I was given to them. But as soon as I could hear him, they're returning and coming to the house, I would quickly have to put everything away.
So I've read that your father didn't speak to you?
He quit speaking to me the last year I lived at home.
Okay.
It was also my last year of high school. And when 2 months before I finished, he sent me a message. He wouldn't talk to me, so he sent it to my mother. But when I graduated, I would have to leave home. And that's when I left California and headed back for New York City.
Right. Well, that was fortunate.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you.